welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My name is Jessica. I am your host today, and I am here with the author of a really interesting book that blends mythology, historical fiction, art, and so many other things. Please introduce yourself and tell us about the book that we will be talking about today.
Hi, I'm Crystal King, and I'm the author of 3 novels. My first was Feast of Sorrow, which is about an ancient Roman gourmand. My second is called The Chef's Secret, and it's about a Renaissance chef who is a real person. And my third novel, which comes out at the end of September of this year, is In the Garden of Monsters. And it is a retelling of the myth of Hades and Persephone, and it's told from the point of view of a model that Salvador Dali brings to a garden of stone monsters, which is a real place an hour north of Rome.
So let's first talk about the real place and how it kind of inspired you to write this book, because as I mentioned, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of history in it, and I had no idea that this place existed before reading your book.
Yeah, it is a place that I visited probably 4 or 5 years ago for the first time and never had any intention of setting a book there. I was visiting Caprarola, which is a town nearby, and was working on a novel that is set there. And the driver that I had hired to bring me around, because internationally driving is a thing that I didn't want to experience. He took us, me and my husband, to this garden, just said, "Hey, it's nearby. Do you want to check it out?" I'm like, "Sure, why not?" And so this garden is in the town of Bomarzo. And like I said, it's an hour north of Rome. And I find that a lot of Romans don't know that it exists, which I find fascinating. It was built by a man named Vicino Orsini, Pier Francesco Orsini, who went by Vicino. And he created the garden really to shock his guests and to awe. He dedicated it to his wife, although he wasn't the most faithful of husbands. It was more probably because she was a very faithful wife to him and managed his affairs while he was a mercenary over for the Pope. And when he settled down, he created this garden, which is has all these statues in it that are made from the stone that's in the ground already. So there's pecorino stone, and there is gods and goddesses. There's a siren. There's a dragon fighting a lion and a wolf, and there is a temple which represents heaven. There's a bench to Persephone, statue of Demeter, or in my book, Ceres. And Persephone her name is Proserpina in the Italian and the Latin. And there is a mouth to hell, which is are also in the shape of an ogre or orco. Also, Orcus was another god of the underworld, so there's another play on words there. So there's this huge mouth that you can walk into, and there's a table that acts as his tongue that you could have a meal at inside the mouth of hell. So it's just this incredible place to set a Gothic novel.
And while you were talking about it, I had to go back and look at just all of the crazy pictures of this place, because it really is unreal. And just the fact that it's not as well known in the local area, to me, is absolutely amazing. But you mentioned that it was dedicated to his wife Julia, and the name Julia is extremely important as well in this book, because we have our main character who is also a Julia, and she's the model that Dali hires to be his Proserpina. This is what he's going to paint her as, Proserpina. You also meet Dali's wife, who I knew very little about. I actually did not know as much about Dali as I know now, so thank you for that. And it just has this really interesting just sense of foreboding, because it's set in the past, and you find out that Dali is a fascist. and unapologetically so, which I was having a conversation with my coworker recently, and we were just like, yeah, if anybody was as unapologetic as he was back then, if
About
Twitter existed
anything.
back then, he would he would have been so canceled in like a second, because he just would not stop praising racism and fascism and monarchists. But now I know, but I knew very little about his wife. So you have Julia, who is this model, but she also has no past, which was very interesting. She's going to be his Proserpina, and you just get this sense that she's being paid to work in this garden and to pose, but she just feels very much like she's being treated like a pawn and a toy. And every single bone in my body was like, oh my goodness, you need to get out of here. So
That would
Julia
make a good
herself,
book, right?
it would make a great book, and it was. So Julia herself was a really interesting character too. So how did this Julia kind of grow out of the Julias of the past?
Yeah, so there are, as without doing too many spoilers, there are a few Julias in this book, and Julia needs to uncover why that's the case. And Dali is ends up being affected by the garden. The garden affects everyone that's in it in a particular way. And it's so hard to like talk about it without being too spoilery. Julia is a character who's trying to discover herself. She has an art student. She arrives at the garden, and Dali is painting her, and she takes the jump thinking, not just because she's a model, but also she wants to learn from him. And he treats her like that's impossible. You can't learn from me because women can't be artists. And he believed that. He believed that women should not be artists, that they were muses. And he loved women, but not in the way that people would imagine. He was, and to talk a little bit about like what you were saying, he was a character. He was a person, I should say, not a character. I tried to stay true to his persona in the character that I wrote.
Yeah, I mean, but one could say he almost like positioned himself as a character, just sort of
He,
with his whole persona,
yeah,
right?
he's a character of something, right? But he was somebody, I don't know if I wouldn't call him a fascist necessarily or a Nazi, but he admired the power that those dictators wielded. And he was fascinated with the ability to enchant and charm people. And he was very charismatic, but he was very problematic. And he existed to shock. That was his whole modus operandi. How can I shock you? And that was because he was a narcissist through and through to the very end. His wife, Gala, is fascinating because, and a lot of people don't know too much about her. And we have a tendency right now, I think, in this part of in the world that we're in, to look back at history at women as really being misaligned and that they weren't portrayed in the right way. Whereas I think Gala, there's a lot of information and documentation about how awful she was. She was somebody who Dali worshipped the ground she walked on. He dedicated paintings to her. He wrote his cookbook is named Le Dîner de Gala, and he just loved her and worshipped the ground she walked on. And she used him for his money and for his fame. But she was the reason he became famous. She was his manager, and that was to his benefit and his detriment at the same time. So I took those ideas and played with them throughout the whole book. I don't know if I answered your question.
I don't know either.
I'm
Now
just
I'm trying. No, I think, yeah, because these are people who are historical figures, and they truly were interesting, and I did learn a lot. And it's funny, I was also saying to my the same coworker that with Gala, usually I would say this is the case of history being really mean to a woman who is in the proximity of a creative man. But then again, there seems to be, again, a lot of evidence that she was quite,
She wielded the power in that relationship,
yes, which
100%.
is really interesting because, as you mentioned, Dali is or was a narcissist, and generally one doesn't think of a narcissist as parlaying any of their power. And also, I do believe, just kind of going back to it, he did consider himself, I believe he had said several times that he was a monarchist himself, which yeah, I suppose, again, it's like it's the power, but man, I really just had no idea.
Yeah, but he was also a genius. He was somebody who definitively shaped a lot of the way that art developed in the 20th century. And he was very charismatic. He would throw wild parties and have all these celebrities that would show up. He had a collaboration with Alice Cooper. He did work with Disney. He designed the Chupa Chups label for the pot lollipops. And he did like fashion design. He was just a man that had incredible talent, and he made use of it. But he was very complex, very definitely.
So when it came to bringing him to this particular story, were you always planning on that? Did you always see him as an integral role in the story?
Not at first. I was worried about including him for all the reasons because I don't want to get canceled, right? And people are very they're a lot more judgmental about books than they were in the past. So I'm conscious of that. And so I was concerned, do I want to go there with him? But the more I learned about the garden and just how weird it is, and the more I learned about him, the more I thought this just makes sense. He went there, he filmed a little movie that's like 3 minutes long, and you'll be able to find that on my website the book launches. And it just it made sense. But that said, when I wrote the book, I toned him down a lot, a lot. In fact, so much that my editor was like, maybe you should just leave Dali out. But by that point, the book didn't make sense if I did that. And so then she said, well, either that or you have to ramp it back up. And so I had to find a way to show and to do more with Julia responding to this weirdness and to his unconventional ways of looking at the world and his racism and his admiration for fascist. I had to figure out how to do that, so I had to kind of make him weird again. But I did, even still, I really toned it down. And if you want to learn a lot about Dali, his autobiographies, he has two of them, are just incredibly eye-opening and shocking, absolutely.
Another part, and you did mention this briefly when you were talking about Dali and Gala, and it fits very well into a retelling of the Persephone myth, is that food had a very big place in this story. I was reading, and the more I read, the hungrier I would get. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about just if you want to talk a little bit about the role of food and how much it was inspired by myth, or how much just the whole Dali persona, as you mentioned, because he also loved food, correct?
Yeah.
Played into
And
it.
so my first two novels are about culinary figures in Italy. So I've done so much research and on food history, and my husband loves to cook, and we both love a good meal. And I didn't start out thinking this was going to be a food book, but it turns out this book has more food in it than both of my other books do. And what was freeing about this one is that because I'm not writing about a culinary figure, but I can play with this whole idea of what to do with these pomegranate seeds. Because if you're familiar with the myth of Persephone and Hades, Persephone ends up having to stay in the underworld for part of the year because she has consumed a certain number of pomegranate seeds. And some myths say 3, some myths say 6. It's mostly 6. And so I had a chance to fool with that. So then I had to figure out what food she would eat these pomegranate seeds in. And of course, not all the food could have pomegranates in it, but so there had to be lots of meals. And so I took my love of history that I hadn't been able to talk about in my previous books. So there's a book it's a book about, interestingly enough, dreams, Polifilio's a dream. Hypnerotomachia Polifili is the name of the book. And it's this weird novel like book that came out in the 1400s. And it has all these weird dreamlike sequences where Polifilio is trying to find his love. And one of them is this dinner that has like plates that change color with every course, and the servers their outfits change color, and the tablecloths change color, and the food is crazy and elaborate. So I took meals from that, and I got to play with different eras in time with these meals. And then, of course, Dali has this cookbook that came out in 1973, I think, and a wine book that came out a few years later. And in it are wild, elaborate meals, mostly done by some French chefs and Parisian chefs, because they were living in Paris, I think, at the time this came out. And they're really elaborate, so elaborate that my husband and I haven't made anything from them because they're just too much work, and the ingredients are they just don't make sense in our world. And we like cooking with wild ingredients, but this one just is so complex and difficult. But I took that, and a lot of those recipes, and I put them into the novel as kind of like Dali is thinking about this in 1948, and eventually he's going to write a cookbook sort of thing. And I did work with a bunch of chefs and food bloggers, and I recreated some of these recipes. And when the book is out, there's going to be a downloadable cookbook that people can access on my website, crystalking.com, that will give you the opportunity to try some of the recipes from the book.
So when it came to the supporting characters and the background characters, how much of them were fully formed? You have Julia's friend, you have Jack, you have, how do I pronounce it? Is it Idonius?
Oh, Adonius,
Yes.
that's the name for Ignazio.
Ignacio, correct.
Ignazio, he is the
Ignacio.
host, and he is the person that basically takes them through the garden and takes care of them. But he also has some really interesting connections to the garden that you start to learn about over time. And he is this very enigmatic and sultry, like this is one of the characters that Julia finds herself torn between. The other character that she finds herself torn between is Jack. And Jack is this real like guy next door. He was in the army in World War II, and he gets out and he decides he's going to stay in Italy. And he's from Idaho. He's actually from Burley, Idaho, which is where my grandparents lived. So, and he's just this like down home good guy, right? And then you have this like polar opposite Ignazio on that's the Latin lover kind of stereotype, I guess. And Julia finds herself caught between the two of these people. And then there's Paolo, who's the man who carries all the cameras around. And Jack is kind of the heavy lifting for the easels and making sure that things get around. So Jack and Paolo are the assistants for Gala and Dali. But Jack is more than an assistant in this relationship, because Gala is a very sexual creature. And so I play with that as well. And Lillian's
Yes.
character. Lillian is Julia's best friend. And Lillian plays a really important role in the book. And she's her roommate in Rome. And she comes to the garden halfway through the book because Julia is just so wigged out about everything that's happening. And Lillian, being the good friend she is, she's like, I'm going to be there. I'm going to find my way. I'm going to get myself there. So you're not alone in this. And so she comes, and I'm not going to tell you anything else about what happens with Lillian.
Well, this was really cool. This was definitely a wild blend of a little bit of everything. And I think there's just a lot to digest, figuratively and literally, here. Thank you so much for sharing it. It was stunning.
Oh, thank you. It was so much fun to write. And it's so much fun to talk about because it's such a cool place and the people are cool. Like Dali was just weird and wild. So it's a lot of fun.
Are you working on anything after this?
I am. I'm finalizing edits on a novel that will come out probably next fall or winter. And it has to do with some ancient Greek gods that are less familiar. And they're doing something nefarious with the happiness in the world. And so I'll leave it at that.
Looking forward to it. So, once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was,
Crystal King with In the Garden of Monsters.
and definitely check out Crystal's website for some of that food recipe stuff, because if you are a foodie, even if you don't cook yourself, maybe you can convince your foodie friends to cook for you. Have a bit of a cook the book party. And check out In the Garden of Monsters, and also research this garden itself because it really is wild.
Yeah, the Sacro Bosco, or if you just search for Garden of Monsters on Google, you'll find it in 2 seconds.
Thank you so much, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.